Continue discussing Isabella or the Pot of Basil. So hopefully you've worked through the activities on the PowerPoint that I sent you by now, and you've had a go at making sense of the poem for yourself. You should by now have read up to the end of stanza 22. If you haven't, can you do that now and then come back to this video? So I'm going to talk you through some of the answers to the questions that I posed on the PowerPoint and give you my thoughts on this section of the poem. So you probably should have a pen handy so you can jot down some ideas, but obviously you can pause the video at any time if you want to replay something or you want to make sure that you're getting notes down. Okay. So I started the PowerPoint presentation by asking you about elements of tragedy so far and what elements we were still waiting for. So I asked you to have a look back at stanza 11. So this is a stanza that gives us a brief insight into some of the romantic moments between Isabella and Lorenzo. We hear about how they meet all eves, so every evening, and Keats repeats the word close to stress their union and their desire to be together, and perhaps, as some critics have suggested, the sexual nature of their union. We'll come back to that later on when we think about this setting. So they're meeting in a setting that is typical of the fantastical and magical nature of the romance genre. If you remember, by romance we're talking about tales that deal with the courtly world of knight and ladies and tournaments, and often magic and wonder and things like that. And we're told that Lorenzo and Isabella meet in a bower of hyacinth and musk in this stanza. And this is really important, and it's an idea that Keats keeps coming back to again and again in his poetry. Often refers to settings that are described as a bower. Okay, so what we're referring to by a bower is a natural place, like in a garden or a shady spot or in a woodland. It's somewhere that's enclosed amongst trees. And bowers in literature have feminine connotations and associations of intimacy and erotic activity. So that's perhaps why some critics think that when these two meet in this bower, it's a suggestion of some sort of sexual activity between the two. So it's suggestive of the intensity and the closeness of their relationship. Bowers also suggest a place that provides an escape, somewhere to go to, somewhere to retreat from the rest of the world. And it conjures up ideas about feminine beauty, nature and magic. And if any of you know Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream, you might remember that Titania, one of the characters who's the queen of the fairies, she is often depicted as being in her bower. So it has all of those kind of beautiful, romantic, magical connotations. So you might want to have a think about how Keats is using a bit of a variation on the bower as well. If you think back to La Belle Dame, in that poem, he refers to the elfin grot, so the elf's grotto, which could be seen as being a kind of variation on this theme of the bower and the retreat from society and this retreat into magic and nature. So if you have a look at the line in this poem, close in a bower of hyacinth and musk, if you know your flowers, you'll know that hyacinth and musk are flowers, okay? And they've got particular connotations that you might want to think about at the moment. So hyacinth has connotations of constancy and sincerity. So if you think about how that connects with their relationship and the idea that there is something constant and pure and sincere about it. Musk has connotations of persuasion, which is interesting. Maybe to think about the idea that they have persuaded each other into this relationship, or has one of them persuaded the other more forcefully, in terms of the force of their feelings, perhaps. The other thing which is slightly sinister about musk is that in Greek history, musk was a flower that was often put on the graves of friends. So there's again a little bit of foreshadowing of the tragedy that's to come, and the sadness that surrounds that there. So that's something to think about. Okay, so we've got the young lovers meeting in this beautiful, sensuous setting. However, their love is shrouded in secrecy. And this, you know, that idea of a romance and secrecy, there's the kind of excitement that occurs there, and that there's something pleasant about that. But obviously secrecy also has sort of more sinister undertones. So Keats is making it very clear to us that they meet at dusk, perhaps suggesting they don't want to be seen. And he also repeats the reference to a veil. So all close they met again before the dusk had taken from the stars its pleasant veil. All close they met all eves before the dusk had taken from the stars its pleasant veil. So we've got that repetition there, and that insistence on the dusk and the veil at the end of the lines, which our attention is drawn to. So dusk and veils have got this idea of an impending darkness, but also the veil's got ideas about concealment, which reinforces this suggestion of secrecy. The other thing that it's important to think about at this point here is the importance of the choice of time that Keats has used. So dusk, as well as being a perfect time for romantic liaisons, is also the time just before nighttime, so just before kind of complete darkness. So this is significant symbolically because it's perhaps an in-between time. So it's not quite dark yet, but it's no longer daylight. It's this kind of marginal or liminal space, this in-between time, a time when things perhaps could have turned out differently for the young lovers. There was kind of still a hint of daylight, still a hint of hope before the darkness and the tragedy, metaphorically speaking, that descends. If you think about night as being a metaphor for darkness, for death, for tragedy. Okay, so we can see there that darkness is indicating a threat, but by the end of the stanza, Keats is even more explicit about this. The narrator points out that Isabella and Lorenzo were safe in their bower, unknown of any, free from whispering tale, which makes us realise that perhaps Isabella and Lorenzo's reluctance to declare their love for each other initially didn't just stem from a fear of rejection, but it was also related to some sort of threat from other people knowing and what those other characters might think or might do. This comment from the narrator is important as once again it develops the sense of impending threat and tragedy, but simultaneously the narrator is withholding key information from us about who the main cause of that threat might be. So Keats is enticing us here and building us a sense of anticipation. We're wondering who we should be worried about finding out, but continuing to withhold information from us, which is an interesting technique that he uses quite a lot in this poem. So the increasingly intrusive narrative voice then confirms that tragedy awaits the young lovers with the lines, "Ah, better had it been forever so, than idle ears should pleasure in their woe." And we know that their secret will be revealed, and the narrator laments that this that this changes for the sake of a good story of a tragic nature, and that we're going to take pleasure from kind of hearing this story, which is an interesting thing to say, really, isn't it? It reminds us that we're reading a poem and that we're reading a tragedy and that we derive some pleasure from it. So he's kind of, the narrative voice is really interesting because it's sort of inside the poem but keeps stepping back from it and commenting on it. Okay, so here starts an interesting diversion into the next stanza on the strange nature of storytelling. I asked you to have a little bit of think about that at the end of our first lesson on Isabella. And what Keats starts to talk about is how the listener delights in hearing all of these tales of sadness and sorrow. And there's some interesting things going on here with the references to ears and hearing in stanza 12, and the synesthesia of doleful stories. Do we see this kind of confusion of hearing a story but seeing it at the same time, which is really interesting. And again, you'll know by now those kind of fusing of the senses is something typical to Keats's poetry. And it's interesting that it occurs here because we've already heard many references in the early stages of the poem to the imagery of the delight that the lovers have in seeing and hearing each other. And there's a sense now that this imagery is going to continue into the next section of the poem with the introduction of Isabella's brothers and what they see and hear. So you can have a look out for that as we go. Okay, you might want to pause there and just check back over your notes and make sure that you're happy with everything that you've got, and then come back to the video when you're ready. Okay, so just I'll quickly divert to look at a little bit of mythology for a second. So the other important thing to note in stanzas 12 and 13 is Keats's use of Greek and Roman mythology. So if you have a look at the images, you'll see we've got Theseus and Ariadne from Greek mythology, and Ariadne saved Theseus from the Minotaur. She used a ball of thread to find the way through the labyrinth at Knossos to help Theseus escape. which is obviously a kind of triumph and a success, but unfortunately he then abandoned her, so there's the sadness and the tragedy that follows. And then from Roman mythology you've got Dido there, who killed herself after her lover Aeneas abandoned her. So Keats is using these allusions quite deliberately to build on this sense of foreboding and the sense of tragedy, and to foreshadow the sadness, the death, the despair that's to come. Okay, so moving on to the main part of the poem to look at today, which is to think about the introduction of the two brothers. Okay, so in stanza 14 we hear about them really for the first time. We find out that they are enriched from ancestral merchandise, which tells us that they are merchants and that they trade. It tells us that they are rich, but it also is a kind of early start and an unflattering presentation of them, because Keats' use of the word ancestral is important here, because he's suggesting to us that they've inherited their wealth and their business rather than created it for themselves, which obviously is something that happens to many wealthy families, but it just is a kind of early indication that these are two brothers who feed on or build on the successes and the toils of others, rather than necessarily always making things for themselves or creating opportunities for themselves in a positive way. So let's look at the language that's used to describe them and to describe those people who kind of come into contact with them or work for them or have dealings with them. And you'll notice in the first stanza at the top of the slide there, lots of very negative language. So we've got words like weary, tortured minds, noisy factories, references to blood, references to the blood and their whip, and the workers having hollow eyes. So it really develops an image of these characters, these two brothers, as being cruel, brutal, people who exploit the landscape through the mines and exploit people through the people who work in their mines and their factories. And it's all seemingly for their own gain. So Keats begins the third line of the stanza with the words "and for them." And he continues this into the next stanza. For then the Ceylon diver held his breath. For them his ears gushed. For them alone. So with this insistent repetition characterising the brothers as greedy and selfish, and that everything is done for them. It's a really powerful section of the poem. Some critics have suggested that it's a bit of an unnecessary diversion from the narrative, that some people feel we don't need this level of detail. Some people take exception to the fact that Keats is quite obviously having a go at sort of industry and money making and capitalist kind of ideas in that sense, and really they would prefer that Keats kept with the narrative. And if you know anything about the Decameron, you'll know that the Decameron was more about plot than developing characterization here, but others find that this is really important and a really useful way to characterize the brother, and that in that respect it introduces the idea of them being villainous, which is an essential component of tragedy, obviously, and it does create an essential sense of inevitability and pity, because the more the brothers are presented as villainous and bloodthirsty and greedy and all of these negative things, it makes Isabella and Lorenzo seem more vulnerable, but perhaps more pure and innocent. So it creates the kind of pity for them, and it creates a sense of impending doom and inevitability. Okay, so in the next stanza 16 at the bottom of the slide here, we hear again the kind of increasingly intrusive narrative voice, which is commenting again on what we're hearing, and it comes through, and it really, in this stanza at the bottom of the slide here, directs our response to the brothers. Keats develops a really angry rhetorical style here through the use of anaphora, with the narrator asking 5 times why were they proud. So we've got really memorable questions, a memorable stanza here which encourages the reader to challenge the motives of the brothers, question their values and question their integrity further. It's clear from this stanza that the brothers have more money than humanity, made plain by Keats' references to the poor. So at the beginning of stanza 16, why were they proud? Because their marble founts gushed with more pride than do a wretch's tears. Why were they proud? Because fair orange mounts were of more soft ascent than their lazar stairs. So we've got reference to poverty-stricken people there with wretches and lazar stairs. And the idea is that the brothers are kind of thriving on making money, but they don't show any humanity or any concern for anybody else. Okay, which is really significant. They're much more interested in their own material gain. He then goes on to highlight that again they've got much more interest in money than any kind of interest or enjoyment in history or culture. And you've got that line, why were they proud? Because red line accounts were richer than the songs of Grecian years. So these are characters who are without integrity, without culture, without empathy. All of those kinds of positive qualities are absolutely absent from these brothers in this early characterization of them. And the stanza ends with a final kind of exasperated question from the narrator. Why in the name of glory were they proud? So there's an increasing sense of anger, of exasperation. And again, this sort of, as well as developing the characterization of the brothers, sets up that further idea of the vulnerability of the two young lovers. Even though Isabella and Lorenzo haven't actually been mentioned for a little while, they're still in our mind and we're still aware of them. Okay. So moving on to the next part of the poem, the next two stanzas, we get a little bit more detail about the brothers and their interests. And Keats speaks of their hungry pride and gainful cowardice. He presents them using anti-Semitic language as mean and greedy, comparing them to Jewish people in this stanza as two close Hebrews in that land inspired. So anti-Semitic references, but at the time would have been recognised as a suggestion of greed and kind of hoarding money and those kinds of things. So it, again, developing this sort of negative characterisation of the brothers. Keats then goes on to present the destructive nature of their greed by drawing attention to their ships, so the property, the things that they use for their trade, which is obviously a sign of success, but Keats draws attention to the fact that they're made from wood, which ships would be, but uses the idea in the fifth line, the hawks of shipmast forests. So reminding us of the idea of the forests that are kind of plundered for wood for making ships. So he's kind of characterising their wealth and business deals as something that destroys nature, which is really interesting. And again, if we think back to how Isabella and Lorenzo have been presented so far, they're quite often located amongst nature. In the early stanzas of the poem, we've got lots of references to fields, to gardens, to the bower. They are associated with skies, with stars, with roses, hyacinths, musks. You can go on, if you go back and have a look, there's lots of natural imagery associated with Isabella and Lorenzo. So they're closer to nature, whereas the brothers take from nature and they destroy it, which again foreshadows what they will take from their characters later on in the poem and what they will destroy. Okay. Stanza 17 is also referencing other people that the brothers deal with. We've got the reference to beggar spies and quick cat's paws, and Keats speaks of the ducats and old lies, and all of these references are serving to suggest the brothers' corruption, how they cheat people for money, and how they deal with immoral men. The idea of quick cat's paws is a reference to people who are immoral, so they're kind of making clandestine deals, they're cheating people, they're not doing business in an honest, open way. So again, that's not a very flattering image of the brothers, and further serves to add to their villainy, really. Okay, and again, you might want to pause to just jot down some notes or play anything back if you think you've missed it. Okay, I'm just going to pause for a second on stanza 18 for a little bit longer, and you'll notice that stanza 18 begins with that eye imagery that we talked about earlier on. So we've got this question: how was it these same ledgermen could spy fair Isabella in her downy nest? Which is alerting us to the fact that it's not just money. Sorry, it's not just money and business that these two brothers have got their eyes on, but it's also their sister. And they're keeping a close watch on her, and she's a real focus of their attention. And if you look at how she's presented, so they're ledgermen, so businessmen, men of numbers, men of ledgers, facts and figures, notably figures, counting up the money, whereas she is fair Isabella in her downy nest, which reminds us again of her innocence. It presents her using kind of bird-like imagery there. But also the idea of the downy nest reminds us of the bower that was mentioned earlier, but it also makes us think of perhaps the safety and security that Lorenzo provides for her, that her relationship with him is like a nest. So that's a really sharp juxtaposition there between them as the ledgermen and her in the downy nest. And you'll notice there a little bit of the animal imagery that's kind of bound up with the idea of the nest, and the stanza ends with an image of a hunted hare, which Isabella and Lorenzo almost become like hunted hares and as the poem goes on, but also it's suggesting that the brothers are like hunted hares because of their kind of business deals and the manipulation of people and the trickery and the dishonest, deceitful nature of their transactions, that they kind of can never rest either, that they have to constantly be on their guard. They've got to be kind of aware of what's going on in front of them, but also looking behind them. So there's some interesting animal imagery here. But going back towards the sort of beginning of the stanza again, if you look at, we've got the idea of the brothers spying fair Isabella, so the attention drawn to their eyes and what they can see, and this continues in the third stanza with the reference to Lorenzo's eyes. How could they find out in Lorenzo's eyes a straying from his toil, which makes clear that Lorenzo is distracted from his work by Isabella, but also introduces the idea that he works for them, and that's why they notice. So again, that's another little bit of information that makes us build up this idea of why Lorenzo is perhaps not a favourable match for Isabella, and why their relationship has become kind of somewhat clandestine and secret and hasn't been allowed to flourish in the open because it's not a favourable love match. Okay. So the eye imagery continues to highlight how when a character is greedy and as self-serving as these brothers, they must be aware constantly on their guard. So that's kind of building towards that hunted hare image. I think it's really clever how Keats develops his use of eye imagery throughout the poem, really, because if you think back to the beginning of the poem, all of the references to sight and seeing and eyes were bound up with ideas about looking at beauty at the beginning, and looking upon Isabella, and that Isabella is seen by Lorenzo as this beautiful woman, and it's a kind of beautiful love. But by this point in the poem, the eye imagery has moved towards these ideas of looking in a greedy, covetous and destructive way. So you can see the imagery and that motif building, but you can see how it's shifting and serving a different purpose for Keats. So that's interesting to think about. Okay, moving on to the next couple of stanzas. So you'll see by the beginning of stanza 19, we've got a bit of a shift, and that this is quite a change in tone and a change in focus, and it leads us into another digression that Keats is making. So he has his narrator directly address Boccaccio, the writer of the Decameron, from which Keats has borrowed the story of Isabella and the Pot of Basil. And the narrator asks for forgiveness from this long-dead author for appropriating, stealing his story and converting it into a poem. And he claims that it is done in stanza 20, I think, yeah. He claims that it is done to honour thee. So it's interesting to think about why he does this, why he was in the middle of describing the brothers and in the middle of describing them becoming aware of the relationship, and all of a sudden he steps back from that and digresses to address an older writer. So you can have a little bit of a think about why he does it and if it's worthwhile and if it serves a purpose and what you think about it. I wonder if in describing the corruption and the greed of the brothers and the idea that he's presented the brothers as being successful and taking from other people and kind of tricking them and being greedy, that Keats has almost got a little concern that he might be viewed in the same way himself, that he's taken a story from another writer and is remodelling it for himself. It's one way that you could look at it. Maybe Keats is a little bit insecure about doing that, although he does it a lot, and all writers do. We've seen Shakespeare do it, but is he questioning that? Or it might be just possible to view it as another delaying tactic that Keats is using. He's holding up the narrative and he's making us wait, which obviously builds tension. We know that something terrible is going to happen, but he's making us wait to find out how that's going to unfold and what's going to happen next. So there are a couple of things to think about, and you might have your own ideas as well. Okay, moving on. Again, we go back to the brothers, and these are the last two stanzas that I asked you to look at. So the focus shifts back to them there. So he's finished, Keats has finished detailing their kind of mercantile traders' life, this rich life of money and accounts and business transactions. And he's finished writing really what a Marxist critic might view as being an attack on capitalism and early industrialisation, and perhaps Keats making some points about the society that he himself was living in, not really the society of the poem. So you might want to have a little bit of a think back over this section and the way that the brothers are described, and the kind of dealings that they have with factories and mines and things like that. Perhaps Keats is actually talking about his own society in the kind of early stages of industrialisation. But what he comes back to here, developing the plot about the brothers' role in the tragedy that's about to unfold. So Keats uses opposites again here, and we can see that the brothers, always described as a pair, never really, but at this stage described individually, are juxtaposed with the young lovers. So we've got these two pairs now. We've got the brothers, cunning, plotting, men of money, men of business, and we've got Lorenzo and Isabella, this innocent young couple who are kind of concerned with love and more honourable emotions. So both couples have got intense, passionate feelings. If you have a look at the way the brothers are described, they're described as feeling well nigh mad and having jealous conference when they discover the relationship between Isabella and Lorenzo. So some interesting words there to describe their feelings and thoughts about things. However, in comparison to the sisters' intense feelings, the brothers use theirs for wholly selfish, negative reasons without a thought for anybody else. So these strong feelings that they experience go on to drive the tragedy of the plot. Whereas earlier in the poem we heard all about these intense, positive, passionate feelings that Isabella and Lorenzo have, which are kind of obviously, as I just said before, much more noble emotions associated with love. In stanza 21 then we get to the heart of the matter, that Lorenzo is a servant of their trade designs, and that it was their plan for Isabella to coax her by degrees to some high noble and his olive trees. So we can see quite clearly that the two brothers would never agree, in the context in which they live, they would never agree to Isabella and Lorenzo's relationships, because he is of a much lower status, and Isabella, again kind of thinking in quite capitalistic terms here, Isabella's like a commodity, isn't she, that can be sold to another merchant. So the brothers would never have countenanced supporting the relationship between Lorenzo and Isabella. Another thing to think about there, I think it's interesting how their plan for her was to coax her by degrees to some high noble and his olive trees. I mean, we've talked about how Isabella is presented as being sort of innocent, beautiful, vulnerable, all those kinds of things, but actually she's quite a strong-willed character, isn't she? She's known all along that her brothers would never support this relationship, and she's continued it, pursued it, enjoyed it in secret. So that kind of suggests a confidence and a strength about her that's interesting. And the way that Keats uses the word coax her by degrees suggests that the brothers didn't think that she would willingly marry whoever they had in mind for her, and that she's kind of quite sparky and knows her own mind and has her own ideas about things. So that's kind of revealing in relation to the characterization of Isabella there, and that she's quite strong-willed, and when she puts her mind to something, she knows what she wants. So that's maybe useful to think about for later on in the poem as her character develops. Another kind of final point that I might make about the brothers here is how similar they are in terms of their planning and secrecy to Isabella and Lorenzo. So the brothers plan for the demise of Isabella and Lorenzo's relationship. They meet together, they discuss secretly, they whisper together, and they kind of bide their time. And many a jealous conference had they, and many times they bit their lips alone before they fixed upon a surest way to make the youngster for his crime atone. So they plot and they scheme and they wait, and that's kind of quite similar to what Isabella and Lorenzo did in the early parts of the poem. They were kind of biding their time, waiting to tell each other how they felt, and then planning all of these secret meetings together to get what they want. So, we've talked a lot about the oppositions and the juxtapositions that Keats is using in the poem, but there are also these interesting parallels between these two pairs of characters to think about and help you kind of explore the structure of the poem. And then obviously by the end of this stanza we get to the heart of the tragedy. And at the last, these men of cruel clay, that's a good description of them, these men of cruel clay cut mercy with a sharp knife to the bone, for they resolved in some forest dim to kill Lorenzo and there bury him. There's a bit of a kind of dramatic cliffhanger moment there, isn't there? This build to all of this description of the brothers and this building, impending sense of inevitability and doom, and it's all building up to this moment, the murder of Lorenzo, and this kind of final characterization of the brothers at this point as being without mercy, as being people who will lure him to a forest. There's a kind of fairy tale sort of characteristic quality to that description there, but they're going to take him back to nature, kill him and bury him there. Okay, so we'll stop at that point because I've said enough and you probably had enough of listening to my voice, so you can stop and add to your notes and have a think about what you've heard, and I'll be back to talk to you again next lesson. Thank you very much.